Shared Digital Future, Managing People for Innovation and Fair Work. My name's Colin Lindsay. I'm a professor and researcher at the University of Strathclyde, and it's my pleasure to chair today's session. Today's session is led by the PrOPEL Hub. The PrOPEL Hub is a major new initiative led by the University of Strathclyde and funded by UK Research and Innovation that brings together a range of universities and businesses to look at how we can best support productivity, innovation and well-being through workplace practices. If you'd like to know more about our work, please go to propelhub.org. We're also delighted, particularly today, to be partnering with Glasgow City Innovation District as part of today's online webinar. Glasgow City Innovation District is another fantastic initiative co-led by the University of Strathclyde that seeks to create in Glasgow a hub for entrepreneurship, innovation and collaboration, bringing together some of those innovative companies and organisations to nurture and accelerate growth and innovation. Again, if you would like to know more about the work of Glasgow City Innovation District and how it can support your business or organisation and connect with your business and organisation, please contact Glasgow City Innovation District. And we're grateful for their support and for your participation. So to today's business, again, welcome to today's PrOPEL Hub Masterclass webinar on our shared digital future, managing people for innovation and fair work. The focus for today's masterclass, I think, really came from some of the recent policy activity we've seen around AI and digital. Colleagues will perhaps know that very recently there's been a launch of a refreshed digital strategy for Scotland and the launch of Scotland's AI strategy. My own team here at the University of Strathclyde are very interested in the potential for new technologies to drive innovation, but we're as interested in how we can best align people management, really effective people management, to drive innovation, and how we can align the fair work agenda and support job quality while also making investments in transformative digital and other technologies. And that's really the focus of today's event. And we have two fantastic speakers who can lead us on some insights around that agenda. First, we have Professor Patricia Findlay, who is the director of the Scottish Centre for Employment Research. Many people will also know that Patricia is the co-chair of Scotland's Fair Work Convention, so a leading voice for fair work in Scotland. As importantly, Tricia and her team at the Scottish Centre for Employment Research have done extensive research on the introduction of robotics within organisations and how that can connect with effective people management and fair work. We're also delighted to welcome Hannah Davidson, who is Head of People and Culture at Maidbrave. Again, colleagues will know that Maidbrave is one of the most exciting strategic branding organisations in Scotland, combining brilliant digital products and services, but also, as Hannah will point out, really effective and creative people management to support their people to deliver innovation within the organisation. And we look forward to Hannah's presentation.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Colin. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really nice to have an opportunity to speak to you. Colin said who I am, but so I won't labour that other than to say I have a day job where I work as part of a team of fantastic researchers who do great things. But I also have a role as Scotland's Fair Work Convention co-chair, and I'll pick up on some of those things as we go through the presentation. I thought I'd start off with just some really short comments on the kind of debate that we've been having on automation really for rather a long time. I did think that one of the rare positives of discussing the pandemic for a year is maybe that we've discussed some of these really apocalyptic predictions about automation much less than we had previously, and that was probably a good respite for everyone. When we talk about automation, we often end up in a very polarised place, where we're either talking about a bright or a brutal future. So when we look at the policy documents, for example, that have emerged in Scotland over the last few weeks, the digital and the AI strategy, they present a very, very positive view of what digital and what technology can do for our lives, very broadly, our lives as workers, our lives as citizens. And that's often a very, very attractive prospect. But on the other hand, we have these very pessimistic, apocalyptic predictions about rising job loss and associated rise in inequality as a consequence of automation substituting for the work that lots of people do. So we have this kind of odd optimists. We will have less work, more leisure, work will be more high quality, we'll have much freer lives. And then we have the pessimists who really focus very much on that issue around job destruction. And some very exaggerated predictions about the scale of job loss, although more recently a much better attention to how tasks rather than jobs will be automated, and therefore more constrained or more cautious predictions about the impact of jobs. So not 35% of job loss for the UK, but rather maybe 7 to 8% of jobs might be affected by automation. But even if we get away from the worries that automation is going to eliminate jobs, there is a big question about what technologies do to the nature of work. What do they do to the experience of work, the quality of work and how it's carried out? And we know from a whole host of research that could go in either direction. So as Francis Green's noted, the consequences of technologies for the quality of work, they're not obvious. They're something that doesn't adhere to an ironclad law, but they could vary. One of the real worries, of course, is not that there's a possibility of different kinds of outcomes, but that the nature of the UK economy is such that we will end up with a poorer set of outcomes for automation. So either, on the one hand, you've got that argument about the UK doesn't adopt automation enough, doesn't invest in technology enough, and partly that's to do with issues relating to the nature of work. High levels of low pay mean there's less of an incentive for businesses to substitute capital for labour. But the other part of that debate is the prospect that automation will be used not in a way that enhances the nature of work, the quality of jobs, but in a way that either reproduces, entrenches, or makes worse the quality of jobs because of how automation is approached. And as I say, there's a particular concern that there's some evidence in the UK that automation is associated with things like a decline in job discretion and a decline in how people experience work or the use of skills. And there's quite a nice paper that you might want to have a wee look at called No Automation Please We're British by Spencer and Slater, which really outlines those really stark issues for the UK. So either the UK doesn't invest in new technology, or it opts for cheaper technologies, or when it uses technologies, they're focused on routinizing work rather than being taken as an opportunity to make work better, make work more interesting, make it higher quality. And they relate that to the broader UK productivity problem. And that's a problem for us here in Scotland, because if that's how automation is likely to be used, then it's entirely inconsistent with the policy priority that we have given in Scotland for a number of years now to fair work. So the idea that fair work is good for individuals, good for the economy, good for society as a whole, and that there's a good argument to encourage employers and to use policy levers to try to support fair work. And you know from the digital strategy that fair work is part of the national performance measures, and producing high quality jobs is something to which the Scottish Government is committed. So when we talk about fair work, as we've defined it here in Scotland, we're trying to capture all of those really important elements of job quality so that you have an effective voice in your workplace, you have opportunity to access and to develop and work, you have security of work and employment, and all of the things that go alongside that, such as income and hours. Particularly that you have fulfilling work, work that challenges you, that uses your skills, that allows you to develop new skills, and that you have respect at work. So that might be respect for your health and safety, it might be respect for your work-life balance. And all of those are part of the vision to make Scotland a leading fair work nation, which we will have to address in the context of also addressing those issues around automation. These are not two separate debates. And I suppose my main point I want to make in this short presentation is to say it just doesn't have to be like the terrible predictions. Automation doesn't of itself determine job quality outcomes. Job quality outcomes are a consequence of how employers decide to adopt and deploy and implement technology. And I'm not suggesting for a second that when employers engage in technology adoption, they do it with a blank sheet of paper. They're constrained by a whole host of different things, by the markets they operate in, by the availability of skills, by some labour market constraints. They're obviously constrained by their existing technology and organisation of work, and by wider institutional, social and economic factors. But that doesn't take away from the fact that employer choice remains real about whether and how to automate. So employers can choose to automate while maintaining or enhancing job quality, or they can use automation to both eliminate labour and routinise the labour that's left. And I would argue that's a very, very bad move for a whole host of very different reasons. And really what I want to do today is to talk about a little bit about some research that we've been involved in that does precisely that, where employers have thought very seriously about the implications of automation on broader job quality and have made some interesting choices. I'm just going to share a little bit about those projects with you and then move on very briefly to some current work that we're engaging in at the centre. So a few years ago, we've done two projects, really, one on automation, robotic automation within the hospital pharmacy sector, and more recently some research on robotics automation within community pharmacies. So similar in that they're both pharmacies. They're both dealing with pharmacy dispensing and the clinical work around that. Different because hospitals are in the NHS and so they have one context, and community pharmacies are not part of the NHS. They're independent private businesses and often quite small ones. Now I'll talk about the differences in those a little bit later on. I'm not going to go into details of case study methods and things like that with you because you don't need to know it. What I would say first of all is when we talked about PharmaServ, which is obviously in a way of anonymising our case, it's a highly complex organisation spending £120 million a year on medicines delivered on 14 main hospital sites by around 350 staff. So why was there any discussion at all about automation within this organisation? The first and foremost driver was patient safety. Pharmacy dispensing and distribution is where you can make lots of mistakes, and patient safety of course has a high priority for people and professionals in the NHS. So patient safety and the delivery and dispensing of medicines was first and foremost. The other big issue for PharmaServ, for the health board in which PharmaServ operated, was that too few hospital patients were able to see a clinical pharmacist. Clinical pharmacists spent a lot of their times usually in basements in dispensaries dispensing drugs rather than front-facing roles with patients. And there was a desire to move to accessing better pharmaceutical services for patients. Pharmacists themselves spend a long time training to be pharmacists, and a lot of those skills were not being used. So there was a broader professionalisation issue about how pharmacists could act in clinical teams using their clinical skills rather than using some of their lower-level dispensing skills. And like every public organisation, there was an agenda of cost containment, so trying to improve services without necessarily increasing costs. What were the options available then? Well, one option was to separate dispensing from clinical pharmacy and outsource it. That happens in some health boards in Scotland, it happens elsewhere in the UK. But there were real concerns within this health board about losing control over the quality of the dispensing and distribution service. Another option was to bring in lots of new managers to substitute for some of pharmacists' tasks. So to take over some of those indirect tasks and leave space, leave every other job the same. But the last option was to try and invest really heavily in the skills utilisation of the workforce. So to get staff at all levels, I shouldn't say leavers, to work to the top and beyond of their skill set, so that if you push everybody's skill set up, at the top, pharmacists don't do routine tasks, clinical pharmacists go and do healthcare. So quite basically, admin workers would take over the role of pharmacy support workers. Pharmacy support workers, so some assembly tasks, pharmacy support workers would take over the role of some technicians, which might be in assembling and putting together prescriptions. And then technicians would take over some of the final release tasks, which pharmacists did, leaving the pharmacist to go and do clinical healthcare. The criteria for change in PharmaServ was that they couldn't increase operational or staffing costs, but they could spend money on capital, which is often a feature of public sector budgets. They had to do that in a way that was consistent with their own organisational values, which was about high-level, high-quality patient care. A commitment to using the skills which the organisation had invested in and the talents of their own workforce. And indeed, because of partnership working in the NHS, a commitment to consultation and partnership in how they designed the service and associated automation. And what they did then was to bring in some robots, developed a significant case to have a robotics facility containing 8 robots working in tandem and 1 separate robot in a separate space dealing with narcotics, in a robotics facilitated pharmacy distribution centre. And what that meant was that a lot of the dispensing that goes into hospitals and wards and other pharmacy settings would be delivered from that central facility. So that was a major investment in automated technologies. And the purpose of that was that you could develop dispensing efficiencies, safe dispensing efficiencies, which were really important, substituting a robot for routine tasks of assembly. But you would need something more than that in order to translate that efficiency in robotics output to patient care. And what that needed was some alignment in how people deployed their skills and how people worked alongside the new robotics technology. So as I say, 8 robots working together, responsible for really a complex operation, the procurement and automated distribution of medicines to replenish ward and site pharmacy stock in 4,000 different destinations. So a really highly complex logistical challenge. And what that meant was most staff who worked in pharmacy dispensary moved out of hospitals where they'd worked in a dispensary team, and they moved either towards or they moved to this pharmacy distribution centre. And that's what it looks like. I always hope these robots will look much more exciting, but that's the outside of a robot and that's the inside of the robot, and they don't look terribly exciting at all. They simply safely and efficiently and predictably distribute drugs. So what did that mean? How was that done in ways that impacted on the job quality and work experience of the staff? Within this, because of that professionalisation project and the commitment to using existing staff talents, then there was an explicit upskilling objective. So people were able to access additional training and accreditation for some new staff, resulting in new forms of work, new job descriptions. People with higher level skills were able to use those higher level skills much more frequently rather than losing them, acquiring them and losing them. People, of course, had to get new skills alongside working with robots and skills of interfacing in a proximate way with robotic technology. How was that experienced? Well, for the vast majority of staff, the outcome was massively positive. Their work was much better. It wasn't as repetitive. They had greater task variety. They worked on wards as part of integrated clinical teams and ward teams, which meant that they interacted with a much broader group of workers and professionals. And their roles, although they were more challenging, were much more positive. Now, when I say the vast majority improved their job quality, it wasn't the same for everybody. So the people who were left in the dispensaries doing the same job in the same place ended up less satisfied than everybody else. And the people in the PDC who faced a completely different environment had a much more mixed set of responses, which I'll return to in a second. So just as an example, ward support workers talked about preferring to be on the wards, doing a much better job, interacting with different people, and really having transformed their own job quality by that move, a move about which they were incredibly nervous to begin with. In terms of their work environment, people preferred working on wards, they preferred being close to patients, they preferred building better professional and technical relationships, except if you were left in the dispensary, because there were fewer of you, you were doing the same task, it wasn't as interesting, and you were less interacting with the colleagues that you knew were interacting much more broadly. So a small group were left a little bit behind. For the PDC, it was quite different. They ended up in something that looked a lot and felt a lot like a factory, despite the fact they really needed to have pharmaceutical skills. So that was quite a big cultural transformation from being in a hospital, proximate to patients, to being in something that felt probably a lot like working for Amazon, but with much higher levels of skill. In terms of broader employment quality, nobody did badly out of this automation. So terms and conditions were preserved. Any changes in people's job roles were protected against any detriment, and that really supported effective implementation. There were some issues around terms and conditions, so people felt that they were doing a bigger and a better and a more challenging job, and sometimes that wasn't rewarded. There wasn't any increase in reward or recognition for that. In terms of career progression, for some staff, for the majority of staff, there were formalised progression pathways, which meant they could improve their careers and improve their income. There was better access to training, better access to interdisciplinary working, but that was much more limited for the people who stayed very close to the technology, which is something that management have thereafter wanted to respond to by improving forms of rotation between different parts of the organisation, so in and out of the PDC and wards. So in all of this, what was very clear was a management commitment and a choice to build job quality as far as was possible into the design of automation, and to keep job quality as an important part of what managers considered as automation developed, because of course there have been a number of stages to how the robotics have been implemented. Not everything was done right at the beginning, of course, because it never is. But as they moved forward with some of these things, job quality and the experience of their employees, and particularly using their skills, stayed a major focus. So it's really important, I think, to think about how employers how they set out their objectives, what decisions they make in terms of automation, seeing that as an input and not an output to the process. So it's not about adopting technology and seeing what happens next to jobs and the nature of work. It's about designing that into the process and making sure that as far as possible, though not perfectly, the vast majority of staff were able to improve their experience through engagement with automation. I just very quickly jump to look at our community pharmacy studies. So what we've done in community pharmacy is to research automation in real time. So to follow community pharmacies through from the decision to adopt technology, through the pre-technology adoption stage, through the implementation of technology, immediate post-adoption, and 3 months later post-adoption, to try and look at the experience throughout that process and its implications for a variety of different objectives set for the community pharmacy businesses. And you'll see from the slide that the drivers in community pharmacy were very similar, this emphasis on safety, delivering safe and effective pharmaceutical care. Pharmacies are places where mistakes can have huge consequences, so safe dispensing becomes very important. But as you'll also appreciate, particularly in the pandemic, pharmacists are supposed to be there to deliver healthcare. So you should be able to go to a pharmacist and not see them tick off a prescription, but speak to them about healthcare issues. And that might be on an individual basis, or they might run specific clinics to be able to do that. But for the community pharmacies, what was different was these were private sector firms, often small, often family firms, and therefore issues of business performance and business sustainability were also crucial to the automation decision. Again, I'll say it very quickly, so I don't want to run over time. The clinical service outcomes associated with having a standalone robot that took over the dispensing part, much as it had in a hospital setting, but in a much smaller scale, was that it released pharmacists' time to deliver healthcare. So other people took over the tasks of final release of medicines, because the robot made final release of medicines much more safe. Okay, so the fact that you have to tick off the final release of a prescription, you can be more confident in a technician doing that if the technician has had the robot deliver the assembled prescription. So pharmacist time was released, safety was improved, although that varied with different types of technology. So the completely robotic technologies were the best in terms of patient safety. Patients themselves reported very positive feedback in terms of seeing pharmacies as providing safe, efficient, personal and excellent services. Workforce outcomes, nobody lost their jobs, which is often people's fear when it comes to automation. It didn't have much of an impact on pay. Some, pharmacists did a bit better, support workers did a bit worse, but it wasn't a very big impact. Interestingly, one of the things which happened as a precursor to automation was that pharmacies really studied their own workflow, and that was really important. Actually taking apart your workflow and understanding where the bottlenecks are and what works and what doesn't work, both in terms of process efficiency, but also in terms of job quality, was really important. And for a lot of the staff, work intensity reduced, particularly pharmacists themselves, although there was something of a difference with higher skilled technicians who were taking on higher tasks. But for everybody, the robot produced a much calmer, a much more straightforward and a much more stable working environment. In terms of business outcomes, in the short term, we didn't see massive changes. There were marginal increase in monthly earnings through the NHS contract, although not for all the pharmacies. It didn't really reduce the time it took to dispense a prescription, because pharmacies were very efficient before, but it did improve the time that was spent on stock and stock monitoring and produced efficiencies there. It allowed an increasing demand for prescribing to be met without doing anything new or recruiting new staff. And interestingly, one of the things, and this is as a business outcome, if you're a pharmacy owner, one of the things that really matters is the extent to which you have time. As well as being a clinical pharmacist, you have time to run your business and time to have a life. And it had a massive increase in work-life balance and well-being for pharmacists. So the pharmacy and the robotics projects tell us an awful lot about how you can design in good job quality to automation. I'm going to do a terribly shameless plug. Our team have moved on from the robotics projects that have just finished to look much more broadly at how do we think about the relationship between the sorts of work and management practices that engage employees and how those create innovative outcomes. So not necessarily using a fabby robot, but using the skills and talents of your own staff to identify, to problem solve, to identify innovation solutions, to support innovative behaviours and the kind of things that people do to support innovative behaviours in workplaces, and to use that as a way of driving, as innovation does, higher productivity and improved employee wellbeing. And that's a project that's running across our own unit and our colleagues in Eva Demerutu and Arnold Bakker in the Netherlands. And we're really interested in that, in really the same processes. How do you make the decisions as managers to adopt the types of practices that allow you not to do automation in this project, but allow you to generate the kinds of engagement that let you drive broader innovation? So very much focused on the same issue about the potential to use job quality as a driver of innovation and as a driver of support for automation, rather than seeing them as being in conflict, as much of the literature suggests it has to be. And I decided to put that shameless plug in because if you want to be part of this study, you should get in touch with us. We're very interested in working with companies across key industrial sectors who employ more than 100 employees.
My name's Hannah. I work for a company called Made Brave. We are a global strategic branding agency, primarily based in Glasgow, but we are now starting to operate in a global landscape, and we have team members based in Glasgow, Edinburgh, we have some in London, Peterborough, we have one in Amsterdam, so we're starting to spread further afield. We were born in 2012. So a little bit about our roots. Our CEO, Andrew, decided to go it alone and go freelance in 2012 when he had a 2-week-old baby, £1,000 in the bank, and yeah, either a daft decision or a bold move, but hence the name Made Brave. That is when we were born. And yeah, basically since then we've grown, we've plateaued, we've grown, we've plateaued, but we're 9 years old now. And we do a full mix of things, everything from strategy and insight to brand creation, content and production outputs, and digital marketing. But really everything is primarily led by brand, and that is what we would say we are expert in. And we basically help our clients achieve the most that they can through these mediums, and a digital leading tech is obviously a huge part of that. Excuse me. So these are some of our clients and partners that we're very proud to be working with at the moment. So yeah, that kind of landscape has changed for us recently as well, and we're seeing more global partners come on board, which is absolutely fantastic. So over the last few years, we have been very lucky to be recognised as a good organisation to work for. So we've seen kind of awards from Campaign, the Drum in Marketing, Marketing Society, And actually just last week, I'm very pleased to announce that we have been recognised by the Sunday Times Best Companies, Best Places to Work, as one of the UK's top 100 companies to work for, small companies rather, one of Marketing and Media's best agencies to work for, and one of the top 40 employers in Scotland. So yeah, absolutely delighted with that. So basically I want to talk about culture at Made Brave. So this is one of our meeting rooms that we did decide one day randomly just to turn into a massive ball pit, and that was just something that Andrew decided, our CEO, very randomly last minute, and it was very fun. But it's one thing, and it's very easy to look from the outside into Made Brave and go, oh, they've got culture nailed, you know, because it's very exciting and it's shiny. And you know, this was Christmas a couple of years ago. We decided to put a giant snow globe in the middle of our studio, and everybody arrived and they were really surprised, and it created a lovely experience for everybody around Christmas. You know, we put a lot of investment into our spaces and our physical spaces where we collaborate with one another, where our clients visit. And, you know, in fact, we've actually got a kind of creative technology lab, you know, and it's a space where people can experiment and play with technology to really get into that creative mindset for our clients. And these things, these are great, but these are add-ons to our culture. And our culture is very much made up of people and the way that we interact with each other, which is based on our values, our purpose and our vision, and the kind of employer that we want to be, and the kind of place we want to create. So we believe that, you know, brand reputation, if you like, one of the sayings that we quite frequently come back to is that your brand isn't, you know, it's not what you think it is. Brand is what other people say about your brand when you're not in the room, if you like. So we believe that brands are built very much from the inside out. Excuse me. So what we ask ourselves frequently is, well, what are our team saying about our brand when we're not in the room? You know, and sorry, just one moment. I'm not used to talking so much. Yeah, so we very much place a strong emphasis on getting feedback from our team regularly. So we do that through the mediums of pulse surveys, regular one-to-ones, discussions, places where we can really generate feedback. And by doing so, by giving our team that voice, we are able to be in the room to hear what they are saying about us, you know, and about what it's like at Made Brave to experience life as a team member at Made Brave. Excuse me. So we very much believe in values and purpose-driven business. And I want to talk a bit more about purpose and clarity of purpose because, excuse me, we've had a vision from day one at Made Brave, and I have to say it's been a very exciting place to work because we've always had a leader who is very inspiring, who creates this energy at Made Brave that makes you excited and makes you want to be a part of it. And when you think back to that kind of first bus event, you know, that's really powerful to be excited, to be, you know, you've seen the kind of, you know, nice things that we do at Made Brave, the events and things, but the vision, you know, it's always been apparent that we want to be this best place to work, but the actual strategy wasn't very clear, and it wasn't very clear on where we were going as a business and how we were going to grow or what we wanted to achieve. And that was some of the strongest feedback that we got from our team in terms of, well, actually, these things are really nice and these are really fun, but what I'd really like to know is, how can I progress here? How can I contribute to where we're going? Where are we going? So I really like this model, which was processed or published, sorry, in the Towards Maturity report, the New Learning Organisation in 2017. And I think it's so relevant right now as well. But right there in the centre, you'll see that clarity of purpose is key. And they talk about these 6 elements as being absolutely essential for businesses to succeed now. And businesses need to work smarter and not harder in order to succeed. And I think focusing on learning as a tool for innovation and success is really the only option that we have these days, because we're now in this space where information changes rapidly, technology is changing rapidly, and given the recent crisis with COVID, we've all had to start working very, very differently. So we all need to be learning and focusing on learning so much more. So basically, off the back of that feedback, we decided to put a much bigger focus on strategy, on creating a vision for individuals, because we know how powerful that can be. So these are our top 3 OKRs. So, well, that was the first step we actually took, was to move to an OKR framework, which stands for Objective Key Results, for those of you who aren't familiar. And it's very much, it's results and outcomes focused. And the idea behind that is that you create alignment right across the business in terms of where you're going. So our top 3 OKRs are here. And these were then scaled right across the business to team OKRs and individual OKRs. And we started to talk about these quite frequently, pepper them into PDPs and one-to-ones, you know, actually including individuals to find out how they think that how they think they can contribute at an individual or team level to reach these goals. Now, these are big goals for 2024. We're basically like reaching for the moon and going for it. But this is, you know, it gives us something to aim for. So the other strand there that I'd mentioned was, you know, values and purpose-driven business. But values really only mean something when you can bring them to life and put them into action. And again, based on the feedback that we got from our team, and we get regularly from our team, what we found was that, excuse me, they weren't quite sure how to bring our values to life. So just to touch on what they are, our values, which were actually agreed collectively with our team. So they were created with our team, I think it was around 2016, 2017. But we, you know, we have these 4 guiding lights, and we want individuals to be brave. You know, we want them to say, well, I think that this is the best decision for the business based on this, this, and this, and I'm going to make that choice as an executive decision. I know I can do that, so I'm going to be brave and push that big red button. We want them to think big for their own role, think big for that piece of work that they're working on, and think big for our clients. You know, and we dream big and we take ourselves to new heights. But we understand that actually we're amigos without egos. Sorry, we're great individually, but together we are a force to be reckoned with. And actually we leave our egos at the door, because when it comes to the best idea, job titles do not matter. We work together. And then finally, be your weird self, which is exactly what it says on the tin. It's come to work and be you, be your whole self and bring your whole self to work. And that's okay. And especially when it comes to things like well-being, we want you to know that you can come to work and feel safe enough and, you know, okay enough to discuss whatever's going on in your life. So come to work, be you, and that's what makes you awesome. So just to kind of jump back to what I was saying there about the individuals not really knowing how to bring those to life. If you think about those, we're asking a lot of people, okay, you know, don't be scared to just go ahead and do it. Just, you know, just take that risk. Just, you know, push that big red button. Don't feel like you need to ask us. But without kind of clarity on purpose, clarification around the parameters around their role, you know, and what autonomy they have, actually, we discovered they didn't feel safe to. They didn't feel like they could. So we had to do something about that. So, and this really kind of takes me on to this point of creating alignment between, well, the vision that you set, the intent that you have, and the impact that you have. Because if you think about that, I quite like this analogy of the head, the heart, and the hands. So, you know, you create that vision, you set that purpose, and that's what your strategy's up here in your head. And you know what the intent is. Well, we want our team to come to work and feel like they can be themselves and they have autonomy, and the intent is good, but actually we've not set the parameters. So operationally, they don't have the tools or the resources or the means to be able to do those things. And without that, you're going to get very little creativity and very little innovation. So off the back of a few things really, off the back of that feedback, off the back of the COVID crisis over the last wee while, we have been putting a much bigger focus on learning and development around human skills, and creating a framework which kind of underpins all of our policies going forward. So we touched on quite a few big areas. They're not small subjects, but we touched on emotional intelligence, psychological safety, and developing a global mindset. And I'll just run through each of those one by one. How am I doing for time, Colin? Am I okay?
We're coming towards the end of the hour, Hannah, so...
Yeah, no worries, that's fine.
You're doing okay, but...
sorry for the little bit at the beginning lost. Okay, cool. So the first one that we really explored with our team, and we held workshops, we brought in subject matter experts and third parties to help us facilitate these. But the first one we looked at was emotional intelligence. And I think that emotional intelligence is so important because not only in a normal work setting, but especially now that we're not in the room together, we have to understand that we're human and we're human first. We are driven by our emotions. We have two parts of this brain, the thinking brain and the feeling brain, and we very much do think and feel everything. So our interactions at work will very much be driven by our emotions, and it's important that we understand as individuals how to look inward, how to understand, what triggers your emotions, and how to manage those, more importantly, for effective working relationships. So the focus on emotional intelligence for us has been a really core part of creating this ecosystem. And we had a workshop with a company called Connect3, who I can highly recommend. They're fantastic, who came in and really helped us understand a little bit more about emotional intelligence and the power that it could have for successful working relationships. But it's really the precursor to the second one that I want to talk to you about, which is psychological safety. And I could spend an hour just talking about this one thing. So psychological safety is really, it's creating an environment where people can be vulnerable in terms of they are included, they can contribute, they can challenge the status quo, they can share their ideas and opinions without being punished or without fear of being punished. I think, I don't know if you've ever been in a position where you've asked a question and you've been ridiculed, or you've been asked for feedback only to be treated with hostility when you give that feedback, or maybe you've been a target of like a negative stereotype. All of these things and these kind of social rejections, they actually trigger the pain centers in the brain, and we treat these like the body treats these similarly to how they would react to like physical pain. It reacts in the same way. So you can imagine the actual impact that might have on somebody in a workplace setting. So I think around 80% of people will actually then worry about one incident for so long. And I think I did a qualification with Leader Factor, and this one they mentioned that after an incident like that, 48% of people will actually decrease their effort into what they're doing because they feel wounded more than anything. So when people are punished for being vulnerable, it's like they will then give you a little bit of their hands operationally, a little bit of their head, but they will not put heart into anything that they're doing. And it's it's inclusion at its most fundamental level. So if you think about these 4 stages of psychological safety. You have inclusion, so you belong, you are welcome, you are respected as you are, and you are invited to connect here. And then the next level of learner safety, where you are invited to contribute, to share ideas, to learn, to ask questions. Then contributor safety, you are safe to then apply that learning, to make mistakes, to fail, you know, within context, you are allowed to do so. And then challenger safety, to challenge the status quo, basically to say, I think there's a better way to do this. Could we improve on this? And basically, without psychological safety, if you have that fear, so if fear is up, then innovation is certainly going to be down. So what you really want to do is flip that around. You want to create a place where fear, you know, there is no fear. People are safe to ask questions. And I don't know if you've ever had like a team meeting, or even, I suppose, in this Zoom setting recently, it's probably become more prevalent, where you've said, right, okay, we've come to the great session, the end of a great session. Does anybody have any questions? To be met with kind of silence, and then only to be asked questions later on. And that's maybe because people didn't feel comfortable, they didn't feel safe to ask those questions in that group setting for fear of, you know, being embarrassed or maybe being humiliated. And what you can see here in this slide is this kind of sliding scale of respect and permission. So if you have high respect and low permission, it's essentially a little bit like paternalism. If you have low respect but high permission, well, that is leaning towards exploitation. So it's a fascinating subject, but psychological safety has really helped us as a business to start to kind of tap into some of these areas within our teams. So I'm pleased to report that actually when we did these surveys across our team, we actually had a really good response, but you know, the work is not done there. It takes years and years to build cultures and environments with psychological safe spaces, but it can take mere moments to destroy. So this is education that we'll be continuing on an ongoing basis, looking at quarterly surveys with our teams, looking at resources, toolkits and tips for managers and how they can actually create those safe spaces. So that might even just be using certain language, you know, little guides that they can check into. There's so much information available out there on this topic. But I'll move on. The third section that I wanted to talk to you about was kind of developing this global mindset, because we're now in this global landscape. Nothing is out of reach or too far, it would seem. So we've wanted to really put a focus on not just a global mindset, but developing a growth mindset, because in order to have a global mindset, you really need to be open to being curious, having that ability to see beyond your own geographical location, to embrace different experiences, etc. And who knew this talking business was thirsty business? Yeah, so we just had a workshop on this recently, actually, and it was so enlightening and so interesting. Basically, do not be put off by this scary slide. We've been exploring the work of Erin Myers and the culture map. And what we wanted to do was to open up the conversation around how different cultures do business and what that means for human interactions. So really it draws upon the 2 skills that we've already learned and talked about, emotional intelligence and psychological safe spaces, to then lean in to enhancing our cultural relationships, if you like. So we explored, I think it was, you know, Switzerland's one of our biggest clients. In fact, 3 of our biggest clients are from Switzerland now. So, you know, it's quite interesting. If you look at this map in that context, you can see that when it comes to communicating, they're quite low context. So you don't have to read between the lines with what they're trying to communicate to you. They'll probably be quite direct. Whereas if you look at the other end of the scale here, you've got Malaysia, and they're quite high context. So quite often you will need to read between the lines in terms of what is actually being trying to communicate. Excuse me. You'll see here, back to the Switzerland one, you know, they will tend to just give direct feedback. And I could go through them all, but it's really, really interesting. And what it's allowed us to do is to really explore our workflows, our processes, what it means for those interactions. So if you think about it, say we're doing business with a company who is based in Malaysia. The way our business operates is that we'll do creative outputs, but it will be based on your feedback throughout an iterative process. So, right at the outset, we need to establish how that relationship is going to work in terms of, do we need to invite you to give direct feedback on specific things, or will they feel comfortable enough just to give direct feedback, etc. So it's really opened a whole new area for us to learn in, but it's certainly enhancing the relationships that we have with our clients who we're working with on a global scale. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on this third kind of strand of that ecosystem, which is freedom, trust and respect. So the way that I kind of view that ecosystem is, you've got your human skills, which basically lay the foundation for everything within your business. And that, because people interactions inform everything else. So we have decided that these three pillars are the things that will inform and guide all of our policy, which is obviously our operational, what we're doing with our hands. And the most recent thing that this has guided was our flexibility framework, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But really, I think one of the biggest things that you can do for your team is to trust your team. It sounds obvious, but it's not a common thing within business, especially in the UK. I mean, if you look at the way that we responded to COVID, all of a sudden, lots of businesses who were absolutely, not for remote working, had to put remote working in place, and it became this kind of epiphany of, oh, this works. This works. Actually, my team are being more productive. If you can make it happen, if you have the technology to facilitate it, then actually this could be a really powerful, positive thing for us. And I think it's helped businesses really see that. So, if you have hired an individual, well, why not trust them? They're in. If you're in, you're in. That's what we say. We encourage goodwill, and we, once you do that, you really will see innovation and creativity thrive when people feel good. Literally, and it comes down to putting the right parameters in place so that people know what they can do, so that they know that they have the right level of autonomy, and you can trust that the individuals within your team have a clear sense of direction and have a clear sense of the contribution that they can make, so they can be trusted to go off and do what they need to do. And freedom, exactly, it's a level of autonomy that's relevant and meaningful for individuals within their teams. And really, because with autonomy, you get empowered, and you start to grow yourself, and you start to learn, and you start to see the bigger picture. And then really just this respect thing, coming back to fair work, we want to create a place to work that is fair for everyone. And these three pillars are really what's going to inform all of our policy creation going forward, because as I said it earlier on, I'll say it again, we all have a role to play within our business. Job titles don't matter when it comes to the best idea. So I think just touching on what Patricia had finished up with there, there's a real opportunity across businesses to innovate with technology, but actually the biggest opportunity is to look at the human skills that are available within your teams, how to empower managers and individuals to work in a way that is collaborative, that is going to empower individuals and is going to unleash that creativity, because they're in a space where it's safe to do so. It's safe to experiment, it's safe to make a mistake, and that comes down to the job design and understanding the parameters around where it is okay to make mistakes and where it isn't okay to make mistakes, because obviously we just can't have everyone free for all making mistakes left, right and centre. They have to be calculated and considered. Excuse me. So, you know, just on that basis, we recently launched our flexibility framework, and that was off the back of the fact that we decided we wanted to be a work from anywhere business, but we weren't quite sure how we would bring that to life. But after some careful kind of thought and consideration, we decided that actually it's much more than just location. It's about creating flexibility for individuals in a way that's meaningful and relevant to them. That's not going to cause any concern for our clients. It's not going to impact their work. In fact, it's going to enhance their work, and in a way that can enhance well-being for individuals, create better work-life balance, and give our team something back and make something for everyone. So freedom, trust, respect. This policy heavily relies on those three things because we all have a role to play.